I thought what I'd do for tonight is try and just give you three simple core messages from the book, three themes that run throughout the book, that the rest of the book, A Case for a Carbon Tax, can try and fill in. And the three core messages I want to leave you with are these. First of all, a carbon tax is transparent. We say we like transparent government, transparent laws, transparent policies. There's nothing more transparent than a carbon tax. Nothing, especially in the area of climate policy, do we have a policy that communicates its costs and implications to the consumer more clearly. So that's number one. Number two, a carbon tax, more than any other policy, recruits the power of what I call the little guy. I was trying to be gender neutral there. I couldn't. Little gal sounded a little weird, and little girl even creepier. But anyway, you get the idea. I think climate change and solving climate change is not about big government programs and game-changing technologies. It's about small innovations and small steps that we take, given the right price signals to take these steps. So that's number two. And then number three is that a carbon tax is easy. We already highly regulate fossil fuels. We collect gas taxes at the pump. We collect all sorts of taxes when we buy natural gas from a natural gas provider. A carbon tax is something that could be up and running within, a couple of months, as opposed to all these other climate policies and schemes which may require the creations of new bureaucracies. So anyway, those are the three things that I want to leave you with. Let me kind of take these in order and try and fill in some of the blanks. A carbon tax is transparent. It's hard to talk about climate change in this economy. I get the sense that politicians would rather talk about green jobs or a green economy. And I can understand that. I'm not in politics, but I can understand kind of the messaging role of that. But it still strikes me as a little, I don't know what, a little fishy. If you talk about green jobs, it's as if, advocates are trying to run away from the fact that climate change is going to cost us. It's going to cost us, I don't know, what do we call them, brown jobs? And it's not that we shouldn't do it. We most definitely should do it. But there's something about that kind of a messaging strategy that, in my view, is not long-term sustainable. And we saw that with the cap and trade debate, right? There was a time when we thought we were going to get federal cap and trade legislation to reduce greenhouse gases. The Waxman-Markey bill passed the House of Representatives. It looked like the Senate bill was going somewhere when Senator Lindsey Graham was still one of the co-sponsors before he bailed out. But I think opponents said, that's a cap and tax bill. It's not a cap and trade bill. And they were right. And the whole problem with the messaging behind cap and trade was they were trying to tell people that it wasn't going to cost them anything. But of course it's going to cost them something, and of course it's a cap and tax bill. Because if we want people to reduce their emissions, then we really have to make them pay for it. So it's an uncomfortable message, especially in this economic environment, but I'm afraid we have to say we should do something about climate change, and it's going to cost us something. Now, if I'm guessing right about this audience, I think the response to that is at least partially on your lips. We have to do something about climate change, because if we don't pay something now, our children and grandchildren are going to pay a lot later, right? You've probably heard this before, perhaps not in such stark economic terms, but there are some economists that disagree about the exact, or at least the estimates of the cost of climate change. And there's a lurking wild card, though, that climate change could be bad enough that we could get positive feedback effects, climate effects that could beget other climate effects that could lead to even more global warming, and that the sum total of this cascade of effects could be so great that we get cataclysmic climate change. In economic terms, you may not have heard it put this way before, but if things get really bad, if a number of positive feedback effects kick in, then within the space of 50 to 100 years, world GDP could be about 1% of what it is now. So that's not doing without 32 terabyte iPods. That's future generations of Canadians and Americans queuing up for food and water. It could potentially, as far as we know, there's a small probability of that, but it's a significant probability. It could be that. So in terms of kind of messaging, I would prefer to message it in terms of we could pay a little bit now or we could pay a lot later, rather than try and run from the fact that, that addressing climate change is going to cost us. What exactly am I railing against? What is kind of something that's not transparent? I'm actually going to pick on one of my favorite political figures, actually. I'm not being facetious. This is Senator Lamar Alexander, and this is him talking in 2009 about the need for the government to fund carbon capture and storage technology. This idea that we could suck carbon dioxide out of the stream of combustion of a coal-fired power plant because coal provides for half of our energy. A mini Manhattan Project and a Nobel Prize. This is pretty lofty rhetoric for a technology that, despite a lot of support from the Canadian and American government, still has not met any of the cost milestones that have been put before it. It's still a pretty questionable technology, and you wonder, there's this notion that, you know, if we could only recruit the scientists in pursuit of a higher mission, in defeating an enemy, kind of like Nazi Germany, we could have a mini Manhattan Project, that we could just solve this problem by our collective efforts. But I think that's a mistaken notion. I think the idea that we could defeat an enemy when the enemy is really us, and it's our consumptive society, is a mistaken one. This is a political figure I admire somewhat less. It's the former president talking about he's launching the hydrogen fuel cell initiative back in 2003. This was an initiative whereby the federal government would provide funding for noticeably the big three automakers to develop hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And the promise of hydrogen fuel cell technology is emissions-free transportation, right? So this is the president describing the chemical reaction in which hydrogen fuel cells kind of create electricity which could drive automobiles without the combustion of fossil fuels. And again, he's using this fairly lofty rhetoric. And I think what the temptation is, if you're a political leader, is to promise people something and to not confront them with the idea that they have to pay for something. Of course we have to pay for something. This fuel cell initiative was to cost $1.2 billion over a number of years. But you know, we don't know what $1.2 billion is. I mean, I don't know what that actually means. So it's a lot easier to kind of sound like that, to kind of shower voters with this lofty rhetoric of if we only put our minds together, we can kind of defeat this enemy. You know, there's a saying that governments are bad at picking winners and losers are good at picking governments. I think that's happening with climate change, right? Everyone's got some sort of a great idea for climate change, and everyone's got somebody kind of peddling on their behalf on Capitol Hill or Parliament Hill. And I think what we really have to do in order to kind of get the messaging straight is to say, no, you know, the change for climate policy has to come, you know, from within, and it's not something that's going to be manufactured. And we're not going to have a Manhattan Project to solve this problem. It's got to be something much smaller. So that's message number one. A carbon tax is transparent. It feels like I'm leading with the nose when I say that, to say that the strength of a carbon tax is that it's most obvious about what the disadvantages is. But I feel like the climate debate has gotten bollocksed up with this horrible kind of Washington, D.C. messaging strategy battle where kind of the climate advocates are saying, you know, we can do this and it won't hurt you or cost you anything. And the those that oppose climate policy are perhaps peddling some more egregious kind of misleading things like climate change isn't happening. But if we could just be kind of straightforward about it, I think we could discuss more honestly about what we're willing to do about climate change and what it's going to cost us if we don't. Core message number two is that a carbon tax is about the little guy. There's a temptation for us to think that climate change was created by somebody else, by large industries that pollute. And I was just talking over dinner with Jamie and Trudy about kind of some messaging strategies that have arisen around kind of pollution controls. And apparently what works is to tell people that they're going after big evil polluters. The truth about climate change is, yes, industries do emit greenhouse gases, but don't forget about individuals, right? Every time we turn up the thermostat, every time we throw a log on the fire, every time we decide to drive instead of walk, take the bus or bicycle, we are making our own contribution to climate change. By some estimates, about 30 to 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the United States are the result of individual decisions. So that's not kind of Washington utilities or electric power companies deciding they're going to emit more or less. It's about us and the decisions we make. This is a pie chart of the breakdown of greenhouse gas emissions in 2002. And you can see the biggest slice of that pie is the dark red slice on the right, electricity generation, which accounts for almost 40% of all of our emissions in the United States. But don't forget about that purple slice on the left, transportation, which is largely in the individual realm. What a carbon tax does that most other climate policies don't do is attack that purple slice, transportation, and residential as well. The smaller orange slice on the bottom are also part of our kind of individual carbon footprints. So what a carbon tax does is not discriminate on the basis of your size. And what we can do, therefore, is kind of send the price signal as broadly as possible. This really was impressed upon me. My partner and I were thinking of renovating our house about 2 years ago, and we have a carbon tax in British Columbia. It started in July 2008, and it ramps up over 5 years. It maxes out in July of 2012. But I was struck because we were looking at some pretty substantial renovations to expand our house, and the contractors seemed to be all over the carbon tax. He seemed to understand the exact effect of the carbon tax on the decisions that we would make in terms of renovation. He could tell us that whereas a high-efficiency boiler would have cost us this amount of money and our payback period would have been a certain amount of time in the olden days, under the carbon tax, the payback period was going to be smaller. And we talked about a lot of other things, efficient windows, radiant floor heating as opposed to natural gas heating. But what struck me was that, you know, this is not a guy whose business it is to kind of follow what climate policy is. All he understood was that there was a price signal out there, that the carbon tax was going to impose an additional cost if we made certain choices, and he was able to communicate that to us. I don't tell a lot of, you know, capitalism happy stories, but this is surely one of the ones that kind of give me some faith that price signals do propagate themselves throughout the economy, especially with energy price signals. We probably listen to those more than we think we do. And the other part of this carbon tax is to go back to the theme about trying to stick it to polluters. One of the economic falsehoods I'd like to debunk is this idea that we can impose a cost on just the polluters, because it doesn't work that way. It kind of depends on whether or not, you know, the manufacturer is producing a good that, you know, we really need or that we could substitute away from. But the truth is, if we impose a cost on a polluter, by and large, that is likely to get passed down to us. So the idea that, you know, we could stick it to polluters is just not true. We are likely to see the costs in one way or another. The only difference being is if we impose a carbon tax, that cost is likely to be less than if we make the more emotionally satisfying move of regulating them and mandating that they install pollution control equipment or whatnot. We could do that. It might make us feel good, but that's going to cost us, the consumer, more in the long run. Okay. There's another part of this little guy story that I like to tell where the little guy gets to be a hero. And part of that is the contractor story I just told you, but there are a lot of little guys out there that otherwise might not get covered by a regulatory umbrella like we're approaching, like we're using the Clean Air Act to regulate. Under most cap-and-trade schemes, under most regulatory schemes, you've got to answer the question of whom do we regulate? If we have a cap-and-trade scheme, who are we going to require to hold permits to emit? And the answer is mostly this, that if you emit 25,000 tons of carbon dioxide or its equivalent every year, then you're it. You're on the hook. You have to hold permits to emit, or if you're being regulated under the Clean Air Act, you've got to do whatever the EPA tells you to do. Well, for the rest of us that don't quite emit 25,000 tons per year, what about us? On the one hand, we also we also have our carbon footprint, but we also are capable of some innovations to reduce our footprint as well. Take my employer, the University of British Columbia. That's a nice aerial view of our campus. What's kind of interesting about our campus is that we are kind of insulated from the rest of Vancouver by a huge park, Pacific Spirit Park. That's about 4 times the size of Central Park, and it makes kind of getting energy in and out of UBC a little bit challenging. And it also makes energy provision and heating provision services a little bit of challenging because we can't easily offload excess energy, nor is it particularly easy to get extra energy when we need it. So UBC has had to be pretty creative about providing for its heating and electrical needs. And in the wake of the British Columbia carbon tax, it's had to be pretty creative about how it's going to reduce its carbon footprint as well. BC also requires its public entities, including UBC, to be carbon neutral. So UBC has also had to get into the business of buying carbon offsets. But it's been pretty creative about it in a number of other ways as well. We just got a new law building built, about a $45 million building. And part of the building is a geothermal exchange unit. We drilled down about 400 feet to try and get a good geothermal gradient to provide electricity for the building. It costs about $1.4 million, which is not a trivial amount of money for a $45 million building. And, it's an academic institution. We generally don't spend that kind of money. But when you go to the Board of Governors and say the payback period is only 8 years under the BC carbon tax as opposed to 20-something years where it would be without the BC carbon tax, then the Board of Governors is a lot more amenable to something like that. And I tell the story not because this is a happy story about some relatively affluent people willing to undertake a small sacrifice. I tell the story because the carbon tax really did change the economics of decision-making of what's a relatively small emitter in Canada. The UBC emits about 70,000 tons of carbon dioxide every year, and it has reporting obligations, but under no kind of prospective regulatory scheme in Canada would UBC be a regulated emitter. But here's UBC trying to figure out ways to reduce its carbon footprint. This funny-looking machine is called a Vegawatt. It's developed by a small startup company called Owl Power in Boylston, Massachusetts. It was the brainchild of James Perrett, who is an inventor who had originally gotten his start by trying to work up one of these home biodiesel fuel kits that you can kind of install in your car so you can make your car into a vehicle that burns cooking oil instead of gasoline, at least in part. They smell like French fries from miles away. But anyway, he worked on that for a while, and he decided that, I don't know how else to say this, but he decided it was a saturated market. There are just too many. If you go online and try and kind of find a way to buy a home biodiesel fuel kit, you'll just be inundated with the options that you have. So what he figured out was, instead of having people with these home biodiesel fuel kits running to restaurants and offering to kind of take their vegetable oil off their hands, why doesn't he build something for the restaurant itself? And so what the Vegawatt is an electrical generator that uses used cooking oil as the electricity source. Anywhere between 30 to 130 gallons of cooking oil is used to generate electricity. And what he does is take that and tie it into the restaurant's electrical panel. And this is in a state with the highest electricity rates in the country, Massachusetts, where, so I understand you pay somewhere in the order of 11 cents a kilowatt hour. They probably pay double that for electricity. So the Vegawatt was kind of a welcome energy savings for a lot of Massachusetts restaurants. Now, I also tell this story because I think the future of greenhouse gas emissions is actually with the James Perrettes and the Owl Powers and the Vegawatts of the world, not the carbon capture and storage technologies, not the game-changing technologies. And I'm not, philosophically opposed to things like nuclear energy, but I think by and large all of the energy and efficiency savings that we get that will reduce our carbon footprint are going to come from small guys like James Perrett and the University of British Columbia. All right, so that's core message number 2. A carbon tax is about the little guy. Core message number 3 is that a carbon tax is easy. It's easy because we won't have to set up a new bureaucracy to run it. It's easy because we already collect gasoline taxes, we already collect taxes on natural gas, and for those that kind of burn coal or natural gas as a major energy source, it's easy because we already regulate that. Already, almost anywhere in the world, whenever we dig coal out of the ground, whenever we purify natural gas, or wherever we refine gasoline, crude oil into gasoline, there's a paper trail that gets created. So imposing a carbon tax is literally just adding a line onto somebody's bill. This is our kind of gas bill, and you can see there's a line for the carbon tax that tells us exactly how much we're paying. This was an August bill, so we didn't use a lot of natural gas. But it was that easy. What the BC carbon tax does is deputize every end user seller like Terracin Gas. It's now something else. But it deputizes them to collect the carbon tax on the province's behalf. And similarly, at the gas pump, we pay an extra couple of cents per liter for gasoline. So that's most of my carbon footprint. For the few thermal generating stations in British Columbia, it's similarly small for them. They already kind of satisfy a number of reporting requirements whenever they import coal or natural gas. So for them, it's easy. So as an administrative matter, it's easy. Whoops, premature. It's also simple from a legal perspective. With cap and trade programs, whenever you do anything with the Clean Air Act, there's always some legal question about whether or not the federal government can do it. And if the federal government does it, does that mean Washington State can't do it? There was a fair amount of discussion when we thought we might get federal cap and trade legislation in the United States of what was going to happen to the Western Climate Initiative, of which Washington was once a member and is now just an observer. But the question was, we were going to do this. BC, Washington, Oregon, California, Montana, a handful of other states, plus 4 Canadian provinces. What was going to be the effect of having a federal cap and trade program? Was that going to override the Western Climate Initiative? They eventually wrote a provision into the bills that never actually got passed anyway. that said that it would override it temporarily, but there's some questions about how you deal with that, right? And what do you do when the state wants to do something a little bit more stringent than what the federal government wants to do? This is a very kind of long-standing environmental law conundrum. But with a carbon tax, you get away from that problem. With a carbon tax, if you're a state, you get to raise revenues pretty much any way you want. Washington could impose a carbon tax. The United States could impose a federal carbon tax. They could both impose a carbon tax. And there's no problem. There's no question of whether or not each jurisdiction is allowed to do its own thing. So that's kind of a savings in legal fees that is always welcome. Thirdly, a carbon tax is easy because it's simple to execute. If we were want to take one simple step right now that would preclude nothing else, we should enact a carbon tax, because after that we could adopt a variety of other strategies if we thought they were more worth doing. But the advantage of a carbon tax is that it gets along essentially with all of these other instruments. There's nothing wrong with pricing carbon, even if down the road we decide we're going to, after all, regulate under the Clean Air Act. And finally, a carbon tax is simple because globally, if we're going to get a large number of nations on under the same climate regime, we've got to pick something in which the administrative costs are simple. So can you imagine, for example, having a cap-and-trade program in Indonesia, right? I mean, you've got to set up a whole big bureaucracy, which would be somewhat of a challenge in the United States, but for a country like Indonesia to set up the monitoring requirements is nearly impossible. On the other hand, Indonesia does collect gasoline taxes, and you can well imagine that if they could impose a carbon tax, if they can collect gasoline taxes, they could just as easily add on to that by imposing a carbon tax as well. So anyway, those are my kind of three core takeaway messages about why we should do a carbon tax. I thought I'd talk a little bit about why we don't actually get talk of a carbon tax. You know, we do have bipartisan support for carbon taxes. This is Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate in economics, talking about climate change. And on the bottom right is a picture of Gregory Mankiw, a Harvard professor who was George W. Bush's chief economic advisor for 2 years. And Stiglitz was the chief economic advisor for President Clinton in the early 90s. And the two of them wrote, coincidentally, because the two of them don't talk to each other a real lot, about climate change. And they wrote at the same time that we should have a carbon tax for climate change. So it's something, isn't it, to have someone who served President Clinton and someone who served President Bush come to an agreement on a climate policy. It makes for other strange bedfellows. I was really honored to have these two people endorse my book, write a testimonial to carbon taxes and for my book on the back cover of my book. James Hansen is an Island Press author. And a celebrated climate scientist who has been stumping for climate policy for 20 years now. Kevin Hassett is an economist who also served under the Bush administration. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a fairly conservative think tank. As a matter of fact, when I told Emily Davis at Island Press, and when I suggested to her that she might contact Kevin Hassett for a testimonial, I could almost kind of hear her raise her kind of eyebrow over the phone, because Island Press and American Enterprise Institute often don't have a lot to say to each other. But Kevin Hassett is a serious economist, and he is someone that has been kind of thinking about carbon taxes for a long time. So it makes you think. It makes you wonder if some coalitions can be built over time between people on different sides of the political spectrum. So anyway, why don't we then get more talk of a carbon tax? Well, I think what I think of as an advantage of the carbon tax is also its biggest political liability. its propensity to lead with the nose and talk about how much things are going to cost. It doesn't help that polling organizations take policies directly from Capitol Hill offices or think tanks and just try and replicate whatever they know and try and ask people what they think of it, because those policies are, I won't say they're consciously designed to be this way, but they are kind of systemically biased towards trying to hide the true costs from consumers. So for example, here's a kind of a sensible sounding policy. Should we provide tax rebates for people who purchase energy efficient vehicles or solar panels? Well, in this Yale George Mason Six Americas study conducted last year, 83% of the people said they would strongly support or somewhat support a policy like that. Only 17% said they wouldn't. What about something like fund more research into renewable energy sources such as solar and wind power? That doesn't sound too bad, right? And not surprisingly, 86% of the respondents thought that was a pretty good idea too. What about regulate carbon dioxide, the primary greenhouse gas, as a pollutant? This is what we're doing now. We're regulating it under the Clean Air Act. That sounds like a good idea if you're of that ilk that I was talking about before. We should kind of stick it to the polluter. 77% of the people thought that was a good idea. Only 24% of the people opposed. Well, what about this? What about increase taxes on gasoline by 25 cents per gallon and return the revenues to taxpayers? So we're even giving the money back to you, but we're increasing the taxes on gasoline by 25 cents per gallon. What do people think of that? Well, 65% of the people don't like that idea. It seems obvious, but you might as well ask, should the government help people do the right thing and support them when they do something like purchase an energy efficient vehicle? Well, of course that's a loaded question. You don't have to be a lawyer to recognize that. Or should we make people pay 25 cents a gallon? And even if you kind of throw in that language about returning the revenue, I think sometimes people don't really believe that the revenue really does make it back to the taxpayer. Sure, people are going to say, that doesn't sound like a good idea. Should the government kind of support us when we do something right, or should they punish us when we do whatever we do every day, which is drive and heat our homes? What I think we should do is promote a carbon tax, but what we really should do is talk about all of these climate policies with a fairly transparent cost and effectiveness discourse as well. So we have to talk about providing tax rebates for energy efficient vehicles in the context of how effective that's going to be. How many tons of carbon dioxide are we really going to avoid emitting if we do that? How many people are going to buy it? How often are they going to drive it? What are the savings going to be? And how much is it going to cost us as taxpayers? We don't know what any of these things are going to cost except number 4, of course. We kind of have a sense, even if we're not particularly good at math, we're somehow able to heroically make this calculation about what 25 cents a gallon means when you fill up at the pump. We've got to figure out a way to talk about climate policies on a level playing field where we get to compare apples with apples and oranges with oranges. So we have to be able to look at the costs and the effectivenesses and the relative effectiveness of the different policies. Now I want to end on a cautionary note, because it may not be our choice in the future as to whether or not we enact a carbon tax or whether we even pursue any kind of a climate policy at all. My wife and I are American, but when we moved to Canada, we got sensitized to something else, and that is the effect of the geopolitical kind of world of diplomacy and how it affects Canadian politics and Canadian kind of laws. Canada obsesses constantly about what the United States is going to ask it to do. Now, I bring this up because it may not be such a stretch to imagine that in the future the United States could be in a position more like Canada than it is like what the United States is now. It's not such a stretch to think that China and the European Union may form an alliance that is based on economic cooperation, and that we in North America might be the odd person out, right? I've heard people say that we should kind of rename a carbon tax something more like a fee or a charge, and that's kind of our way out of this. But I think the more sensible and long-term approach is to say we need to prepare for kind of a future in which we may not be the top dog. We may have to play along and prepare for a world in which the world really does take the job of addressing climate change a little bit more seriously. And the best way to do that is to start sending price signals throughout the economy that signal to us there should be a price on emitting carbon dioxide. This is a picture of Herbert Stein, an economist who was one of President Nixon's chief economic advisors. And at one point he told President Nixon, if something can't go on forever, it won't. He was talking about the trade deficits that we were running at a then troubling level back in the 1970s. But I like to remember that because at some point, either one of two things are going to happen on the world stage with respect to climate change. Either the world is going to give up and pack it in and say we're not going to even try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we're going to brace for a climate changed world in which we have more of whatever climate change is going to be delivering to us. Or the alternative is that at some point the world does make a serious effort and say we really do have to try and avoid the worst effects of climate change. And under that second scenario, which is the only one really worth talking about, if it's the first, then we might as well go home right now. But if it's the second, and we're actually going to try, we've got to anticipate that at some point the world's going to ask more of us than they currently do. It seems preposterous now with international climate negotiations deadlocked over the stupidest little things. But if something can't go on forever, it won't. And if the world eventually decides that it can't go on doing it this way, then we're going to have to be prepared for that world. And in my view, the best way to prepare for that world is to start changing our decisions, big and small, right now. And a carbon tax sends the right signal for that. Without a carbon tax, what I worry about is not so much the environment, but we're going to get stuck with a whole energy economy, a whole infrastructure that's predicated on the idea that we don't have to do anything about climate change, that we don't have to worry about reducing carbon dioxide emissions. We're going to have too many big cars, too many sprawling suburbs. We're going to have this network of natural gas pipelines. I'm actually kind of agnostic about this Keystone pipeline that's so controversial. But I worry if we build too much of this stuff based on an assumption that we're going to ship natural gas everywhere, that it's going to be obsolete. And it's going to be this drag around our economic competitiveness. You look at these houses in the Central Valley of California that were ridiculously overbuilt, too big and for people that didn't actually have the money to pay for them. And that's going to be a drag on the California economy for a long time. And similarly, I worry that if we build big, energy-inefficient houses in sprawling suburbs that are serviced by big cars, that's going to be a drag on our economy when the rest of the world has been investing in renewable energies and preparing for a day in which we were going to make a serious effort to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you.
The two examples you gave, the Vegawatt and the University of British Columbia, the geothermal, they're both sort of local answers. Is there anything inherent about a carbon tax that encourages local energy delivery as opposed to more energy inefficient transmission across large distances?
It's not so much the localness of the Vegawatt or UBC, it's the fact that the carbon tax is the only policy instrument that everyone's got to pay. under a cap-and-trade program, under Clean Air Act regulation, under a number of other policies, under the Western Climate Initiative cap-and-trade program, you've got to emit 25,000 tons of carbon dioxide or more in order for you to even care. So restaurants, they don't emit 25,000 tons a year of carbon dioxide. They wouldn't care, but they care about electricity prices. If there were a carbon tax in Massachusetts, they actually do have something of a price in Massachusetts because of their participation in a regional greenhouse gas cap-and-trade program. But those costs get passed down to the restaurants that pay higher electricity prices. What a carbon tax does is hit everybody, and that's the strength of it. And that's why I tell those stories, because I could tell you a lot of stories about breweries, hotels, kind of municipal rail kind of districts, schools that are doing small things to try and reduce their emissions because they want to save money, right? What a carbon tax does that the other policies don't do is recruit that kind of little guy energy. A carbon tax, depends on which jurisdiction, which government is enacting. It could be local or not local. One of my arguments is that it could be local, and that's okay. It's not necessarily a net drag on an economy, even if it's just local.
What would your opinion be on having actually a personal consumption tax? The reason why I bring it up, because I think a carbon tax is somewhat narrow. It only dissuades people from using fossil fuels. Whereas overconsumption of flat panel TVs that people buy every year, or cell phones or cars, is really not just about fossil fuels. It's about overuse of natural resources that we will also run out sooner or later, and which also future generations then will be lacking because we just, deplete all the, precious metals or whatever. And that a carbon tax seems to somehow imply that as long as whatever is being produced is made with renewable energy, that's all okay, and it's something that I contest. So so here's my suggestion how to implement that. I mean, you cannot obviously play Big Brother and monitor everybody's purchases, but you could basically upfront charge it, and then when you make hand your tax return in, you get a refund on the first item that you allowed for a certain time frame. Let's say you get a tax refund then for the first computer you buy in a 1 or 2 year period, or the first car, and anything else, the tax you do not get refunded. But I think that would be a little broader than just a fuel tax. I wonder what your opinion is on that.
I wouldn't be philosophically opposed to having all sorts of consumption taxes that are kind of based on environmental harm. But I guess my book, The Case for a Carbon Tax, is really about climate change. And in that vein, I guess I'm just focusing on climate change as a problem, not to the exclusion of the consumption of water resources or other natural resources that are valuable to us, that provide valuable services to us in a variety of other ways. But first and foremost, let's figure out a way to price carbon. And by the way, kind of pricing carbon doesn't completely kind of account for the other environmental harms that we might impose. Manufacturing solar cell arrays might create a number of kind of toxic substances that are hard to deal with. But, it's a pretty good proxy for a lot of things that we consider wrong with our kind of manufacturing economy. And I guess the other question I would have about a kind of a personal consumption tax is kind of the enforcement of it, filling out your tax return. You're talking about all kinds of gadgets, not just the computer. You're talking about cell phones, kind of tires, the GPS unit that I needed to get here.
Well, maybe you would only levy it on fairly big items, not like the
on
cookie
what?
you buy in the cookie. And, maybe you levy it only on very big luxury items or something, or cars. And that, I don't mean it would be universal on everything. Obviously, you wouldn't levy it on solar cells because you want to encourage that.
Yeah. Economists like this idea of something they call a Pigouvian tax, named after an economist named Alfred Pigou. And the idea is a tax is just a charge. You're just paying for the cost that you imposed on somebody else, somewhere else. And it's, I mean, it's not a moral judgment. It's not you're doing wrong by consuming, but you're just kind of taking into account the costs that you should be taking into account. So if you could figure out a way to accurately account for the ecosystem services that are lost when we buy a luxury item like a yacht or a Hummer, then sure. I mean, there's nothing in principle inconsistent with a carbon tax of something like that. I guess I just worry about packaging too many things. We're going nowhere on climate policy. If we could get agreement on like one small thing, a small carbon tax, then that's a step in the right direction. And without necessarily disagreeing with you, I just worry about getting that tangled up, which would attract other kinds of opposition and would kind of complicate the matter politically. So.
Thank you. I think your three strengths of the carbon tax were, all I agree with and explain them very well. But one of the things that I think is a downside, and if you look at the pie chart you had, the three largest sectors, electricity, industry, and transportation, would all respond very differently. They have different elasticities to price. So, and they also have different side effects. For instance, on industry, if one country imposes a carbon tax that isn't on others, you would be encouraging industry to move to where the lowest carbon tax was, unless you could impose it globally. Electricity generation, I think, is the place where the carbon tax idea is the strongest, where there's the most response to the smallest tax, and there are the most alternatives to coal plants. You can build wind farms or do energy efficiency instead of do coal plants. Transportation, I would think when we see gasoline prices vary, you don't see a lot of change in behavior till the gas goes up about $1 a gallon, which would be a very large carbon tax. And so the approach of dealing with the large emitters, like the EPA is proposing, where there is a carbon cost applied to electricity generation, and only the large places, I think that's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of the lowest carbon tax having the biggest impact. I'd just like your response to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Electricity is clearly where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck, and if we just stop there, that would be better than no climate policy at all. I mean, I think we backpedaled into this because we lost cap and trade legislation at the federal level, right? I think the first choice would be to have cap and trade or a carbon tax economy ride rather than regulating through the Clean Air Act. Your comments about industry and transportation are well taken. I think that just a response, it's not necessarily disagreement. In terms of transportation, we do see some long-term responses, right? The elasticity, the short-term elasticity of kind of gasoline prices is pretty low, but the long-term elasticity is a little bit higher, closer to kind of 1-for-1. So if we get a 1% increase in gasoline prices, over the long haul, we'll get a 1% decrease in consumption. So, what I'm talking about is kind of a long-term price signal that I would hope would bring about a long-term response in terms of our transportation stock. Manufacturing, leakage is a problem. One of the arguments I make in the book is that a carbon tax is something we can coordinate better with other countries than anything else. There's something, I think, still weird for China and India, kind of post-colonial powers, about a global cap and trade program where, kind of white bureaucrats in Brussels are telling them how much they can emit. There's something, I think, that's not just kind of economically hard to swallow, but somehow viscerally unattractive for China and India. But I think they would be more open to a carbon tax because they get to keep the proceeds. And if they can kind of use it for whatever purpose they see fit, then maybe that's better. And maybe you can even use carbon tax proceeds to try and address that leakage effect you're talking about, as long as you don't kind of couple the kind of the proceeds in proportion to how much they consume, you might be able to compensate some of those industries just by giving them a lump sum of money that at least they can make some investments to make themselves more competitive.
Well, if there's a global carbon tax, it's the same everywhere.
Yeah.
And the money stays locally.
Yeah.
That leakage doesn't happen.
Right. But I'm saying if there's only a national carbon tax or a pan-American carbon tax, but there's no price signal in China, India, or South America, then the carbon tax proceed that's specific to the U.S. could still be used to address some of the leakage concerns. So.
Thank you.
Hi there, my name's Yoram Bauman. I am an environmental economist here in town. We exchanged
Nice to
an
meet you,
email.
yes.
Hello.
Glad you could make it.
A plug and two quick questions. The plug is that I'm part of a group, and I see some familiar faces here, called Carbon Washington, carbonwa.org, along with Patrick Leslie, who's there in the back, and some other folks. And we're actually working on pushing a BC-style carbon tax in Washington State through legislation or a ballot measure. So if you're at all interested in that effort, then I encourage you to either go to our website, carbonwa.org, or just come give us your card or your email, and we'd love to get you plugged into that. So question number one is, do you think it's a good idea for us to push a BC-style carbon tax in Washington State? Hopefully that's an easy question. And question number two is about sort of what are next steps in BC in terms of process emissions, or as the Canadians say, process emissions, or jet fuel.
Say process. It's kind of
or jet fuel, because I know that those are a couple of the gaps in the BC policy.
Yeah, let me take the last one first. I guess I don't worry a lot about aviation and marine fuel. It's just it's too small a piece of a pie to figure out right now. But yes, we should definitely be pushing you should definitely be pushing a BC-style carbon tax in Washington. Eventually, we're going to come to the realization that we need new revenues, right? Are you laughing at me because of the income tax referendum that was just voted down recently? And no one likes to pay taxes. But, I think about the federal government's deficit situation, and the deficit supercommittee failed to come up with a package. So January 2013, the cuts start happening. I think when military contractors start making layoffs, maybe then we start having a conversation about new revenues. And maybe then we start talking about a carbon tax. And maybe in states that are particularly averse to income taxation, you start talking about revenue sources like from carbon dioxide instead of income. I mean, it's kind of hard. There are even some uber conservative libertarians like Grover Norquist, the head of Americans for Tax Reform. The guy who has secured a pledge from all of the Republicans on the deficit supercommittee that they will not support any kind of new taxes. But even he has signaled in the past that if you kind of tax carbon or gasoline and return every single dollar in the form of income tax cuts, maybe he would consider that a no net increase in taxes. So, I mean, if you talk about carbon taxation in those terms, maybe over the course of time it becomes a less offensive or obnoxious sounding tax than income taxes or sales taxes or some other kind of form of taxation. So eventually, yes, keep pushing. I'll do what I can to help. And the other thing you can kind of say is that by next July, the carbon tax in BC will have fully ramped up, and really nobody's noticed. The world has not gone to hell. And the new Democratic Party, which is the party that was kind of left of the Liberal Party, so they're kind of more liberal than the Liberals, that opposed the carbon tax at the outset, are now on board. So, there are political deals to be made, I think, that could make a carbon tax more politically palatable than it's been perceived in the past.
I started working over the summer with a group called the Citizens Climate Lobby. Are you familiar with them?
Heard.
They're promoting a revenue-neutral carbon tax on the national level. So, citizensclimatelobby.org, there's a local chapter. I took the liberty of putting a few flyers for the group on the table with your book, or talk to me if you're interested. And my question, Pete Stark's Save Our Climate Act, HR 3242, currently has about 8 co-sponsors, I think. What's your opinion of that? It's mostly revenue neutral, but my understanding is he takes about 20% off the top to devote to deficit reduction. You familiar with the act, and what's your opinion?
I may not be familiar with that act. Pete Stark has introduced carbon tax legislation before, as has Jim McDermott and a number of other Democrats and Republicans. I think it's a matter of time before something like that gets a little bit further along on Capitol Hill. The 20% the deficit reduction provision, I didn't know about that.
That's a rough,
Yeah.
from memory. I'm not sure it's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to confess, there have been several iterations of carbon tax proposals in the past, and McDermott, Stark, Rob Inglis, who's no longer a congressman, have kind of proposed these. I've kind of lost track of the specifics of those, but the specifics, the part that matters to me, that I think is the most relevant, is, one ton of carbon dioxide, meets a tax of a certain specified amount. That's the part that I think is the most important. Whatever you do with the revenues, that's kind of political log rolling, and me, I'm pretty tolerant of what happens to the revenues after that. To me, the important thing is the price signal. The idea of revenue neutrality, and I'm not necessarily arguing for that either, is that if you can give money back to people, but decouple it from the consumption decisions they make. Here's this chunk of money, you get it no matter what you drive, then they start to revisit their choices about driving. So that price signal hits them where you want to kind of make their decisions, and I guess the giving back to them of money is just something to make them feel less depressed about having to pay more at the pump.